Good morning if you are in the West Coast, and good afternoon if you are in the East Coast, and good evening if you're joining us like one of our speakers, Sasha, does from Turkey or Ukraine. My name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis, and I also convene the online meetings of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. We have a series of them. WhatsApp is the one that you are here for today, and you all know why you came. You're going to listen to Ukraine from Ottoman Times to today, which will be introduced in a second by my colleague, Victor. Now, I'm going to tell you just a bit about our upcoming meetings. On October 21st, we're going to have another WhatsApp meeting, October meeting, that will feature Sharon Mizbani, the winner of OTSA's 2021 Sidney Fisher Graduate Student Paper Prize, and she'll present to us her paper, Furnishing the Ottoman Empire, Crystal Objects in Sacred Spaces. Also in October, we have another Turkey Now meeting. Turkey Now is not every month, it's occasional. But in October, we have one, and the focus of that meeting will be the Turkish project 100 Sene 100 Nesne, 100 years, 100 objects. A group of scholars, the overwhelming majority of whom have lost their jobs as a result of signing a peace petition, got together and created a place where they can work and came up with a project, an encyclopedia project that takes up the history of the Republic, the centennial of the Republic, in a kind of culture, through the history of objects. I hope you'll find it interesting and join us to listen to it. And in November, our WhatsApp meeting will focus to Halil Bey, whom we lost some years ago. Recently, two of our colleagues, Linda Darling and Fariba Zarnabov, co-edited a volume that just got published, and we will a volume to which students of Halil Bey contributed. So we will talk about that volume and remember Halil Bey all together. These are upcoming meetings, but now I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague Victor, who teaches at the University of Toronto. He's an associate professor of Ottoman and Turkish studies there, and his specialty is the northern Black Sea littoral of the Ottoman Empire, and he actually was one of the students of Halil İnalcık, and you'll see him again at the meeting with Halil İnalcık. Victor, please pick it up from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Baki. I'm very grateful to Baki Tezcan for his initiative in having this OTSA WhatsApp event. History has loomed very large in the current Russian-Ukrainian war. Not only the abuse of history, but also uncritical acceptance and propagation of Russocentric narratives. This meant that the world was unprepared for what happened on February 24th, and on the whole unable to understand what led up to our current catastrophe. The situation is in part because of an intellectual failure. As a result, there has been much reflection and soul-searching in the field of Russian studies, and a broader discussion on the need to decolonize the field. When it comes to our field of Ottoman historical studies, there is also a need to reflect on anachronistic Russocentric narratives that have been taken for granted for far too long, above all for the sake of improving our historical craft. Today we focus on Crimea, where the current war actually started in 2014, and a kind of elephant in the room when it comes to the historical study of the region, Ukraine. Since we will try to have time for questions within the first hour, I will be brief in introducing our esteemed speakers. Dr. Nihat Çelik received his PhD in International Relations at Kadir Has University in 2015. He is a lecturer at the School of Public Affairs at San Diego State University. His research focuses on Turkish politics and foreign policy, the history of the Ottoman Empire, and foreign policy analysis. Dr. Dilyara Agisheva received her PhD at Georgetown University in 2021 with a dissertation entitled Entangled Legal Formations, Crimea under Russian Rule in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Currently, she is a research fellow in the program in Islamic law at Harvard Law School. My old friend and colleague, Professor Oleksandr Halenko, is an Ottomanist historian with a broad range of interests, from slavery studies to Territorial to Ottoman chronicles. The Crimean Khanate is also one of his specialties. His home institution is Kyiv University, but currently he is teaching Ukrainian history at Istanbul University. Dr. Çelik, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Baki for organizing this event. And maybe in the question section, I will talk more about the recent developments. But I want to start by saying that this recent act of aggression is not the first one, actually. When we look at the history of Crimea, we see that its Russian intentions were always at the fore, and it aimed at annexing this region, which was very important. And today I will briefly talk about the first Russian annexation of Crimea in 1783. But before that, I will very briefly provide some information about the history of the region and how it came into contact with the Ottoman Empire. You see the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II in this miniature from Hünername and with Mengdigray. So following 1475, it became the Crimean Khanate, which was actually a part of the Golden Horde, and which was very important from a psychological point of view because of being descendants of the Gengzid dynasty, became an Ottoman vassal, and its dependence, its autonomy changed in different periods, depending on the leadership, depending on the situation in the Ottoman Empire. So we cannot always say it was the Ottoman influence was always so much, but still we can see a growing Ottoman influence over time, which ended up deciding who would become the new Khan. The importance of the of this status was that the Khanate itself was able to support the Ottoman Empire with thousands of light cavalries in case of an Ottoman campaign, and not to mention the importance of Black Sea trade, especially regarding grain, which is also today an important issue in you know, the recent grain supplies issue. With ships full of grain were in the ports of Ukraine, and because of the war, there was a disruption in the trade. However, with the decline of Ottoman power and with the war that started in 1780, 1768, the Ottoman defeat ended up with the Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca, which made the Khanate an independent entity. So the Ottoman Sultan was not able to decide who would become the new ruler of the Khanate, so it became an independent state. And both countries, Russia and the Ottoman Empire, they pledged not to interfere with the domestic affairs of the new independent state. Actually, this map shows the Ottoman provinces centered around the province of Kefe, which was Feodosia, which was at the coast, and they were lost with the treaty. So later, with the Russian annexation, we see that Ottoman stronghold of Özi or Ojakov became a strategic point after that. But the treaty that established the independent state did not clarify what would happen in case of abdication of a current ruler, and this led to further conflicts. And also we must consider the divided nature of Crimean politics, that many tribes existed and their leaders also had powerful status, and the monarch was actually very weak. He depended on the tribes for their support, and there were power centers. And as a result, there were many uprisings. For example, in 1775, against the first independent ruler, Sahip Giray, there was an uprising, and Devlet Giray replaced him, and he was recognized. And later, we see Şahin Giray rising in the ladders of power, who was first Kalgay, and then he also led an uprising, and he became the new ruler of the independent state in 1777. However, he alienated the population a lot with his reform initiatives, and there were revolts against him too. And he was he had been to St. Petersburg. He was very liberal. He was not liked very much in the circles, in the traditional conservative circles of Crimea. And when you read the Ottoman documents, you can see many pejorative definitions of him, like being a Russian tool or even infidel. He was defined that way in the Ottoman documents, and there were uprisings against him. With the 1778 uprising, the Ottomans wanted to interfere. They sent a fleet. However, with the Russian presence in the area and the strongholds supported by cannon fire, the Ottoman fleet failed. And both countries came to the brink of war. However, with mediation efforts of France, the Aynalıkavak Protocol or Tenkihname was signed. It clarified the stipulations of the Küçük Kaynarca Treaty, and Russia agreed to withdraw its forces, and Şahingiray's position as the permanent ruler of the state was recognized by both parties müebbeden or kaydı hayat şartıyla. So as long as he lived, he was the legitimate ruler according to this protocol. My research actually starts after this period. I focus on the foreign policy decision-making process in the Ottoman Empire and how the important decisions that entailed declaring war or making peace were made. And I used the Ottoman sources in addition to the materials from the State Archives of Turkey, or formerly known as the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivi. And there are many difficulties because documents are not available or they are undated, or in some cases the page is torn away. It doesn't, you cannot read the full document. So I also benefit from the contemporary histories of the period, like Sadullah Enveri's work and Ahmet Vasıf's work. And I focus on the consultation councils, which were ad hoc structures with the decline in the importance of the Imperial Council, Divan-ı Hümayun. When foreign policy crisis emerged, the Ottoman government convened these consultation councils, and it is important because these consultation councils later paved the way for transition to a constitutional monarchy. The young Ottomans argued that it was the order of the religion, as consultation is praised a great deal in the Holy Quran. And even in the Turkish Grand National Assembly, which was convened in 1920, we see the verse 38 of the Shura Surah, and they conduct their affairs with consultation, which can be translated as. So it also was used to argue that there was that democracy, representative democracy, was not against Islam. With the decline of the imperial Divan, these councils started to acquire more importance. However, we should keep in mind that there are no clear mechanisms set by Holy Quran, and it is up to the monarch, it's up to the ruler to order convening of these meetings and also decide who would take part in them. So I focus on these consultation councils with regard to the Russian annexation of Crimea. And in 1781, another uprising took place, and the population of Crimea rose against Şahingiray, who was not popular, and the Ottoman government received the news, and the population was supporting Bahadır Giray, and of course with the even Şahingiray's new army, known as the Beşlis, they joined the insurgents, and he had to leave Crimea and take refuge with the Russian military forces in Kerch. And they sent petitions to the Ottoman government to recognize him as the new ruler. We should keep in mind that following the independence, the Ottoman government and the Ottoman Sultan still retained the right to issue the mensur and Teshrifat, which is like an imperial patent confirming the election of the new Khan. And the population sent delegations and letters to Istanbul asking the Ottoman government to recognize Bahadur Güray as the new ruler of the independent state. However, the Ottoman government was not in a rush because they didn't want to violate the peace treaty with Russia. So they conducted interviews with the Russian ambassador, Yakovlev Bulgakov, and they wanted to find a solution to the problem. And the Sultan was always involved in the affair because the population of Istanbul and the Crimean diaspora in Istanbul were influencing the public opinion. And after negotiations with the Russian ambassador, the Russian ambassador stated that even though there are supporters of Bahadur Güray, there are also supporters of Şahin Güray. So it was not possible to find a solution to the problem. And if you are interested in the strategic culture, the timing was very good, again, with all the Crimean initiatives of Russia we see in the starting from 1770s, the American War of Independence and Anglo-French War later, the traditional allies of the Ottoman Empire, Britain and France, were very busy at other locations, so they were not in a situation to help the Ottoman Empire provide any military or diplomatic support. And as a result, you see here the summary sent to Sultan Abdülhamit I about the interview with the chief translator of the French ambassador, which suggested that at that time, the international situation was not suitable, so the Ottoman Empire should refrain from any conflict with Russia and should not breach the peace treaty. On top of this document, there's a Hattı Hümayun, and Sultan Abdülhamit I stated that why should it be a breach of treaty if the population of Crimea wanted another ruler and elected him? So he did not agree with the French policy, but there was not much to do. And Russia finally, Alan Fisher in his books also, let's remember him after Halil Bey, we talked about, also published some of the reports that were arguing for a direct Russian annexation after the peace treaty, but Catherine the Great still wanted to keep Şahin Güray in his place. However, following the uprising, she instructed the government officials to support Şahin Güray at all costs, and again, Crimea was occupied by Russian forces, and Şahin Güray was supported by Russia, so he was able to retain his position. However, the internal strife continued, and later Russia found it that it would be easier to annex the area rather than having rulers there, which was costly. And Ottoman government also started military preparations. Halil Hamid Pasha, the new Grand Vizier, started the preparations such as repairing some strongholds, strategic strongholds, and also sending grain and money, and also military units to Ottoman fortifications along the Ottoman-Russian borders. Again, in this document written by Baht Giray shows the negative view of Şahin Güray among the Ottoman and Crimean traditional circles. And finally, in April 1783, Russia issued a proclamation and informed the world that it annexed Crimea. And this was a clear breach of the treaty in the eyes of the Ottoman statesmen. So they convened a consultation council, among many others. I cannot use every document here, but they decided to declare war next spring after completing the preparations. And participants were asked what to do, declare war right now or wait for the preparations to be completed. And the unanimous decision, that's the important point in consultation councils, they had to be unanimous, and they decided to declare war in the spring of 1784.
One more minute. One more minute.
Yes.
One more minute.
Yes. And the Russian demands did not end, and the Russian ambassador in Istanbul wanted an official recognition, a senate by the Ottoman Empire, to be issued by the Ottoman Empire to recognize the Russian annexation. And another consultation council was convened, and even though some insisted that the reply from the French and British ambassadors regarding a mediation effort should be waited, the Russian ambassador demanded that he either gets the recognition document or he leaves for his country, which means war. And as a result, another consultation council was convened, and after reading the documents and reports from the border commanders, and given the issues such as the lack of discipline and weakness of the military, insufficient preparations, and financial weaknesses, and the possibility of a multi-front war, they decided to accept the Russian demands. And this is the copy of the document, which is dated January 9, 1784, and it was issued and signed by the Ottoman representatives. So this document formally recognized the Russian annexation of Crimea. However, it was not the end, because the Ottoman statesmen pledged to complete the preparations and breach the agreement when the time was ripe and liberate Crimea. So it actually led to the war in 1787. The purpose was to regain Crimea, which was taken away unjustly by Russia. Thank you. In the question and answer sections, I would like to answer your questions if you have any. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And next is Dilyara Agisheva.
Thank you so much for Dr. Tezcan for organizing and taking the initiative and his time for organizing the panel. And so my presentation is built, I guess, following Dr. Çelik's presentation. It's sort of a continuation of what happened to Crimea after the annexation. So I will share my screen. Just a minute. Here. Just a moment. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the second half of the 18th century was defining for the Black Sea region, especially for the history of the Crimean Peninsula and its people. The period was marked by two Russo-Ottoman wars, internal political and social unrest in Crimea, just like Dr. Çelik explained just now, and the eventual annexation by the Russian Empire. After the peninsula was officially incorporated into the Russian enterprise, after Crimea was eventually annexed by the Russian Empire, the Russian enterprise in Crimea was more than an annexation. It was a persistent and deliberate process of colonial control. In my presentation today, I will explore the workings of Russia's colonial rule in Crimea through the examination of law. The idea that Crimea became a colonial space for the Russian Empire has not been explored extensively in other research works on the history of Crimea. In fact, Russia is not generally associated with the global colonial legacy. State officials in Imperial Russia dissociated the empire from colonial narratives as a way to emphasize that the Russian Empire promoted unification of its conquered regions and considered those regions to be integral parts of the empire, not its colonies. In fact, the Annexation Manifesto of 1783 declared Crimea as part of the Russian Empire, extending all rights enjoyed by free Russian subjects to the Crimean population. The same notion of giving equal rights was present in the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, Musalaha ve Muvada, made between the Russian Empire and the local Crimean population. The language found in the peace agreement echoed the tone of the oaths, prisyaga, that were taken by the local Crimeans after the annexation to show their allegiance to the Russian crown. The language of the manifesto, the peace agreement, and the oath projected a sense of uniformity between the Crimean population and the rest of the Russian Empire. However, imperial efforts to produce a veneer of a unified empire conflicted with discursive and material practices that generated Crimea as a colonial space. Inspired by the works of social anthropologists and post-colonial scholars like Homi Bhabha, Richard Keller, Sarah Mills, Stephen Berger, and Alexei Miller, I define colonial space as the place where the essence of the East is manipulated and caricatured. However, a colonial space is never just an essentialized Orient. It is an essentialized or caricatured Orient via equally essentialized or caricatured West. In its imperial and discursive manifestations, a colonial space is predicated on a visual juxtaposition between idealist West and East. Thus, a colonial space is premised on a notion of duality that is always in the process of becoming. As post-colonial scholars argue, the reason for infusing a place with a set of opposing associations is to validate imperial control of the conquered regions. Duality creates an illusion that a colonial space requires imperial intervention to modernize it. The perpetual existence of disorder calls for imperial intervention to bring order. A colonial space is different from a colony. While a colony is an variable location on a map, a colonial space is a process. A colonial space is constantly forming and being claimed. Making Crimea a colonial space involved a transformation of the Crimean physical landscape. State officials and Russian elites changed the landscape by infusing Western infrastructures alongside Eastern buildings. The result was an environment in which opposing discursive categories began to occupy one spatial platform. The process of remodeling a Khan's palace in Bakshasara is a salient example. The imperial architects assigned to the project layered Western elements on top of existing structures instead of destroying the old in favor of a new Western design. Infusing a European look into such a politically significant location as the Khan's residential and administrative center was meant to highlight the presence of Russia on the Crimean political scene. However, this manner of declaring Russian authority was accomplished at the expense of harmony within the visual landscape. The inorganic conglomeration of Eastern and Western elements appeared throughout Crimean physical space and often involved repurposing local objects or styles. In his travel accounts dating to 1793, a geographer and professor of natural history in St. Petersburg, Peter Palas, notes how precious materials from Muslim gravestones were recycled in new European buildings. Likewise, as scholars have shown, most notably by Kelly O'Neill, who's with us today, that Russian noble families built duchess with Islamic architectural elements, such as arches, niches, arabesques, minarets for chimneys, and even Arabic calligraphy, declaring the Shahada. Not only were these elements implemented without a full understanding of the meanings behind them, but they were also incorporated into structures that simultaneously mimicked quintessentially Western traditions, including Greek, Roman, and English motifs. The combination of diverse styles produced an environment where numerous discursive meanings were juxtaposed to Eastern architecture in order to generate a sense of transition from the old to the new, from decayed to developed. The transformation of the physical landscape in Crimea paralleled imperial efforts to shape the region's legal landscape. The imperial officials restructured the legal sphere by reducing the jurisdictional power of the traditional Islamic courts and by introducing Russian legal institutions. The Sharia record of this period notes this sudden change. This year, it reads, this year, 1200, at the beginning of the months of Shubat, the Russian system and the law was established in the country and Sharia was changed. These two lines suggest that the legal change took place in Crimea in 1787. Indeed, the examination of Crimean Sharia court records of this period reveals that no court cases were recorded past February 1787 or Shubat 1200. This statement in Islamic court records exposes the fact that the traditional Islamic legal judges and court officials were fully aware of the transformation. However, the records offer no other clues about the process of this legal change, no details about the fate of Islamic legal scholars, and no reflections on the consequence of that change in the Crimean society. Their silence forces one to look into the lines, to look deeper into the lines of the conquerors' verbose manifestos, find the missing parts of the narrative in the imperial decrees, and piece them together into a story about the loss of Crimean legal tradition. In contrast to the ulama's silence, Russian sources offer the missing details by describing the consequence of the legal change in Crimean society from imperial officials' point of view. In his letter to Empress Catherine the Great, Grigory Potemkin, who was the first governor of Crimea after the annexation, paints an emotional scene when describing the aftermath of the election that deposed old qadis, or judges, and brought new judges to newly created imperial institutions. It reads, "In response to your command of January 29 for the Tavrida province, the government offices are now open. The election of judges and assessors took place with reverence. Festive joy was depicted on faces of all those who participated. The bourgeoisie and the villagers discovered with amazement that they have a right to elect judges. They raised their hands to heaven, sending grateful prayers to the Almighty. It is noteworthy that not one of the learned qadis and mullahs was elected by the inhabitants. These parasites, living in luxury, leeching off others, were not joyful like the rest. There is no doubt that they will not hesitate to try to regain their former status by seducing the ignorant. However, the vigilant government will not allow the ulama to succeed with good and necessary people. The unnecessary people, on the other hand, will not only be released, but might in fact be forced out." This letter offers a glimpse into the private thoughts and perceptions that informed Russian imperial policy toward Islamic law. By comparing qadis to parasites, Potemkin suggests that Islamic judges and Islamic legal system threaten the well-being of now Russian Crimea. Potemkin reasoned that if left to their own devices, the qadis would somehow regain their former legal authority and consequently compromise Russian control of the region. His warnings implied that the unaltered nature of Islamic legal system in Crimea was detrimental to Russian rule. In the minds of Russian imperialists, a civilized society needs to tame its natural but potentially dangerous and wild elements, be they in the physical landscape or legal one. To the imperial officials, the ulama were part of a legal system that was akin to a boundless thick forest. To them, Sharia was a legal system that had no genealogical connection to a well-organized, civilized, or modern society. Just like the impenetrable woods or the bountiful yet unordered gardens of local Tatars, the legal sphere also had to be disassembled and then reassembled in a new and more logical fashion. The unaltered nature of Sharia law in Crimea was threatening the stability of Russian rule. Thus, it is no surprise that during the early period of the annexation, the Russian imperial state adopted a policy of expelling Crimean ulama. Targeting the Islamic learned establishment is evident, for example, in a letter from Potemkin dating to May 1787. Addressing Pravитель области Kakhovsky, the ruler of the region, he makes recommendation to take measures in removing the so-called interpreters of the law from Crimea. Potemkin recognizes that the mullahs were recently deprived of their power, but remained vigilant of the fact that they will continue to influence people and compromise law and order in the region. Therefore, he advises to remove them. In response to his recommendation, Catherine exiled hundreds of people in connection to Ulavan families. This document shows that on July 17, 1787, the imperial authorities expelled 98 qadis and mullahs along with their family for a total of 535 people from Crimea. After 1787 legal reform, the expelling of the qadis, the imperial officials reduced Sharia's legal authority to a narrow range of legal matters. and more specifically to family issues such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. And following 1787, they continued to face the Islamic legal authority continued to face even greater suppression of their rights to adjudicate cases according to Islamic law. This right would repeatedly undergo additional restrictions and modifications at the request of the provincial government or the Senate in the following century. In parallel to reducing Sharia authority, Russian officials introduced imperial legal venues and administrative places throughout the Chavita province in 1787. With this, they created categories and divisions between different legal venues and their area of expertise. So, for example, Islamic courts were for Muslim affairs, upper courts for the nobility, local courts maintained civil order in the country, and a myriad of other courts with their specifically defined scope of authority. Thus, the Russian method of rule in Crimea at the end of this 18th century involved preserving the existing legal system in a significantly disembodied form alongside Russian courts. The message of domination could have been just as clear if the entire Sharia legal system was demolished. However, restructuring an old legal system was a form of epistemic violence that amplifies the sense of domination many times over, without recourse to brute force alone. The existence of the old legal system along new imperial legal establishments, just like old Oriental buildings standing alongside Western structures, declared that the old has succumbed to the new. Restructuring the traditional practices of indigenous cultures alongside imported imperial practices precisely describes the making of colonial space that I defined at the beginning of the presentation. The imperial state reform of the Sharia structure was in part a reaction to the visible presence of Islam on the peninsula. The physical presence of Islam was in its buildings, oral expressions, such as call to prayers, and non-visual manifestations, such as property structures. They projected the predominance of Sharia, in contrast to which Russian rule appeared ephemeral. Having seized control over the religious and legal spheres, the Russian imperial state gained control over the meanings the structures generated. Thus, the imperial power did not assume authority only through physical transformation, like the establishment of new European structures, or through mixture of architectural designs. By gaining control over the Sharia system, the imperial officials took charge of the traditional sphere of legal logic that shaped all forms of social relations, including those that were infused into the physical landscape.
One more minute.
I'm good. Thank you. That's it.
That's it. Okay, thank you very much. Some people said they had trouble hearing, which seems to be okay, but the recording will be intact. So next, finally, we have Oleksandr Halenko. Floor is yours.
Good evening. Let me see where's my presentation. Yes, this is it. Well, I'm far from intention to.
Can you please put on slideshow?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Just let me see it. Excuse me. I
go to the right.
Oh yes, view slideshow. Yeah. Just. I'm far from intention to get you into the belief that Russians know why do they want to kill all Ukrainians. They don't have well-developed Ottoman studies, and the archaeology was on decline in the Soviet Union, and I was one of the witnesses who lived through that time. And that decline was immediate consequence of the extermination of all Turkologists in the who were trained in pre-revolutionary time. I'm not going to talk about this, but my intention is to reveal how much the Ottoman past influenced creation of Ukraine and what actually Russians would like to appropriate or to steal from Ukraine, and for that purpose they decided to start this genocidal war. So what is Ukraine? This is a fairly complicated issue. This is the state that was created by the Ukrainians. This is important to emphasize because now many historians trust to underline the role of other nations, including Russians, Jews, Poles, and all others. But the thing is very simple. This state was proclaimed by the Ukrainian people and in the name of Ukrainian people in 1991. And the state of Ukraine comprises the territory of the province created by the Soviet regime in 1922. The province was a part of Ukrainian ethnic territory that existed at that time. And let us see what was the ethnic territory. This is the map from the 1915, which in brown shows the territory where Ukrainian language was spoken. And for that reason, that maps really represents the ethnic territory of Ukrainians. And with the blue borders show the current territory of the Ukrainian state. Of course, it was changed over time since 1922, but even now you may see that the eastern provinces of Ukrainian ethnic territories were Russified simply during the Soviet time, and well, they now are part of Russia. The Ukrainians adopted their name in the 19th century, so late. And the name itself is derivative of the name of the country, which was first mentioned in 1187. This map shows two areas of the Rus state. The green, the area which was encircled by the Greek punctured line actually refers to original Rus, and perhaps that refers to the initial territory of the Rus state before it expanded to the north. I'm not going into details of that. And the name of Ukraine referred to the areas which are represented here in three parts. Oh, I'm sorry. But in any case, this area is more or less the same. It refers to the territory of the core of the Rus state. So why both Rus and Ukraine, as I say, originally cover only half of the territory of current Ukrainian state, and here is the modern Ukrainian state again, encircled with the blue line, and the green shadowed area represents the territory of that Rus state. So the original core of the Rus state from which Ukrainians emerged covered just a part of Ukrainian territory. And here we are coming to the point. As you may see, the south of the country is not colored on this map. Actually, it is left empty, and this is actually that territory which is under attack now. And this is exactly that territory which was populated for millennia, even before the Ottomans came into this area. It belonged to the steppe people, of course, relative to modern Turks. The first Turk, by the way, came Turkic-speaking nomads, settled in Ukraine by the end of the 4th century, which is 700 years earlier than the first Turk set his foot on Anatolian side. It's not, I understand, it may come as a surprise, but this is it. This is Ukraine. And Ottomans established the presence and control exactly this uncolored territory starting from 1475. The key problem of Ukrainian history, the key explanation, how did ancestors of Ukrainians spread their ethnic territory over this southern part of the country? The key answer to it is the Mongol conquest. It did two major things. It drew territory of Rus state into Eurasian steppe politics. This is one thing. And they divided this territory into administrative and political units, which all known to you, and they are called tumens. And the borders of these tumens were drawn along the river courses of the Eastern Europe, and you may see this borders on the map. And here is the thing. These borders, with the decline of the Golden Horde, turned into the borders of the new emergent states, like Muscovy. You may see it here, like Great Duchy of Lithuania, Moldavia, Wallachia, Transylvania, and all sorts of things. Well, and here Ukrainians, the ancestors of Ukrainians spread from the initial territory occupied by the Slavs, who made the bulk of Rus state population. And you may see on this map densely colored territories actually show that initial territory of the spread of Slavs, and then it spread it over time to the early 19th century. So you see, Ukrainians just took the area which was populated by the Turkic-speaking nomads for millennia. And the problem, how could they do this? I cannot, you know, in 15 minutes presentation squeeze volumes and thousands of books. I'm just asking the major questions. So, of course, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth took part in that. Muscovite state also took part in that because they were conquering forces. But finally, Ukrainians were able to turn this conquered by other states to which they belong territories into their ethnic territory, and they have their own say in history and their relations with Turkic-speaking nomads and the Ottomans who control this territory is the answer. Now, why? Oh yes, the settlement in the steppe required at least two things. I'm speaking in primitive categories. The first thing is to defend your life, because nomads were controlling this territory for millennia, and their way of war was instrumental in controlling this territory. So the first thing that settlers had to learn was the way of war, which was adopted by the nomads. And the second thing which they had to learn is how to use that land. Of course, they settled in the steppe area for the purpose, of course, of making living. They didn't represent any state, and it was sort of and mostly anarchic colonization. But of course, they pursued that very simple goal of making living. How could they make living in the steppe? Ukrainian steppe is somewhat different from other steppes of Eurasia because it is more humid, owing to its proximity to the Black Sea and of course due to big rivers which cross the area. But also they could engage in husbandry, and a huge demand in grain and meat, which they experienced through the markets, especially in Lviv. They, so to say, provided them initiative for further colonization. And in order to adopt themselves to the conditions of the steppe, they again had to learn how the nomads live in the steppe. This map actually shows the spread of Ukrainian territory. Now it is colored in yellow. Of course, it is not quite accurate, but nevertheless, it is good evidence. The colonization definitely moved forward by that time, and also you may see the use of the name of Ukraine. It is here, but it is called Terra Kosakorum, or land of the Cossacks. And Cossacks were that initial force which represented Ukrainian ancestors, who learned first how to fight, how to offense the former masters of the steppe. They learned.
1 more minute.
Okay. So here is the map of the Hotin campaign of 1622, and in this campaign, the Ottomans, for the first time, these are pictures. Of course, I cannot dwell too long on them. for the first time use definition of Cossack tribe, Cossack nation, whatever you wish, in this line. During the armistice concluded on October 9, 1620. Mamma mia. You see, I cannot. You see, bir mahalle Kazak tayfesi dahru tecavüz edilmeye. So in official use, this is the first occurrence of this definition. And by that time, by 1621, the Ottomans realized that they not only face robbers, but they face nation. And okay, I'm cutting at this point just because I have to, in order to demonstrate for you what Ukrainians learned from the Ottomans, I will have to talk very long time. But one thing I would like to say for the finish. The experience which they obtained from communication and interaction with the nomads and the Ottomans themselves was so important that it contributed to distinction of Ukrainians from the Russians. We learned how to fight, and also what we learned from Turks, especially from the Ottoman Turks, is the way how to please yourself in this life. And I, in order to present more evidence to that, of course, I would have to offer you another chance.
Thank you. There'll be a chance during the question answer period for more elaboration. Thank you very much. So we promised to have time for some questions before 1 o'clock, and we have a few minutes. If there are any questions, I will also watch the chat. And I'm looking for raised hands. It's quite hard to see everybody. If there's anyone. There was a question in the chat originally. I don't see any raised hands. Why, from Evelyn Ophir, why was Crimea so important to both the Russian and Ottoman empires? Big question. Who would like to take that?
If I may, very briefly, the area was very important. It was a breadbasket for growing grain, as the first of all, and secondly, it controlled important trade routes. And for the second article, you can include the slave trade, which was very popular, and also the geography of the area, historical continuation. If you look at that, for example, the natural deep sea ports, which were able to host a war fleet, for example. Even today, Sevastopol serves as the important Russian position for the Black Sea fleet. That was important because other ports were in winter around the mouth of the Dnieper River, for example. They were blocked by large blocks of ice, which made the movement and navigation of ships very difficult. So Russia wanted to become a power in the Black Sea, and in order to do so, you have to have the natural deep sea ports.
Okay,
and yes.
Dilyara wanted to say something, and then Oleksandr, and then Will Smiley. Yes.
Yeah.
No, actually, I had a question for Dr. Çelik, if he's finished with the previous question.
Yeah. Oleksandr, you wanted to say something to this question?
Yeah, I have 2 points. Why Crimea was important for the Ottoman Empire? First of all, it was a military foot on the northern Black Sea shore, and it allowed for the Ottoman Empire to control, first of all, the Crimean Khanate, and with the help of the Crimean Khanate, it could control the whole territory of the Eastern Europe up to Moscow itself, which was taken, for example, in 1570. Why was it important for Muscovy is another issue, and this is another symbolic, another symbol, which is important for the Muscovites, and it is still important even without any particular awareness of this. The Crimea is the longest living Chingizid state. This is the longest living issue. Here of the Mongol Empire, and Russian or Muscovite princes couldn't call themselves emperors up until the 1547, when this title was illegally, of course, appropriated by Ivan the Great, and eliminating all traces of the former holder of legitimacy to the title of the Emperor of the world, and that was at stake. It meant to eliminate the Crimea, to conquer Crimea, and to eliminate the dynasty, and that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Dilyara,
you had a question, and then Goswami, then George Theodosiou.
May I add something very briefly, Victor?
Yeah, okay, sure.
It's also, as my dear colleague mentioned, it's also related to the understanding of Kut in Turkish mythology. Yes. It is, he mentioned that it was the longest living Cengiz dynasty that provided a great deal of legitimacy to the Ottoman Empire, because the Kut, or the noble blood, is believed to pass through a dynasty, and only as a result, only members of that dynasty can become rulers. So they are chosen by God. They are the selected elite, and having the descendants of Genghis Khan as your vassals provided a great deal of legitimacy to the Ottoman Empire. That was very important. And secondly, that was a psychological and legitimacy related importance of Crimea. And secondly, the population was Muslim, and the Ottoman Empire had they felt that they had to protect them. That's why the Ottoman government was so much under pressure following the Russian occupation of Crimea in 1782. Because Mirzas, the nobles, were imprisoned or executed, and as a result, they sent petitions to the government to act, to stop the Russian violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilyara.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Çelik. What do Ottoman archives that you've looked at say about Ottoman authorities or officials supporting any opposition movements within Crimea after the annexation? Are there any attempts to sort of undermine the authority of the Russians?
Actually, I didn't, this is a nice question, but I didn't much look into that. But I can tell you that the Ottoman officials were fed up with the upheaval in Crimea. And that in the consultation council, some of the Ottoman officials blamed the Crimeans for the consequences of the Russian occupation and annexation. They, because of fighting each other incessantly, they invited that, and they were, both Russia and Ottoman Empire competed to provide money to the nobles in order to gain their support, and Russia was much more successful in that. And Ottoman officials were fed up with the situation in Crimea, and since some of the nobles supported Shah Hingiray, and they were not in much a position to support any movement, even when they wanted Bahadur Giray to be on the throne, which led to popular uprising against Shah Hingiray. The Ottoman government was not able to do much to support him. That was discussed in the last consultation council I mentioned, in which the Ottoman officials agreed to accept the Russian demands for an official recognition. The members of the ulema who attended the meeting, they held a special meeting among themselves, and they discussed the issue. First, in order to be eligible to help someone, first, one must have the capabilities. If not, then you are under no obligation to help. And secondly, it was seen as sacrificing one part of the body for the well-being of the other. So that was how they legitimized the decision to accept the Russian demands. However, I must add this, at this point, I must add that it was never accepted. The Russian annexation was seen unlawful, unjust, which was a breach of the treaties, and the Ottomans, rather than supporting elements within the Crimea, which was very difficult because Russians controlled the area, they always wanted to gain the Crimea back. I didn't share that document in my presentation, but for example, in one of the Hat Humayuns issued by Abdülhamit I, and also we see a lot about his personality in that document, he went to inspect fortifications over the Istanbul Strait near the Yuşa Tepesi or Joshua Hill. And it's about the Black Sea exit of the straits. And he watched some artillery practice and etc. And he wrote to the Grand Vizier that all of a sudden, when I looked towards Black Sea, I realized that we left the Crimea in the hands of the enemy, and I felt a deep pain in my heart. And also there were other documents which I didn't share here, him urging the Grand Vizier and state officials to work tirelessly day and night and gain Crimea back. And that's why the reform, military reform especially, and the reform of the treasury and income source of the government became a priority following the Russian annexation of Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of the illegitimacy, I remember in 2014, after the annexation, there was a lot of chatter about Küçük Kaynarca being violated, and therefore, by international law, Turkey being successfully Ottoman Empire, Crimea belongs to Turkey. Yes, Will Smiley's next.
Thank you. My question, I think, follows on perfectly from that discussion. It's for both Nihat and Dilyara. I'd like to ask a little more about something I feel like embarrassed I don't know more about, which is the decision by the Ottomans to try to recover Crimea in 1787, since Nihat, you were just talking about Abdülhamid's attitudes. And to what extent was this related to the changes that Dilyara talks about? I'm struck by the timing of the summer of 1787 as the Russians are kicking out Qadrs and limiting the applicability of Sharia. And then in August, the Ottomans go to war. What is that relationship? How much role did that play? Was it coincidental what the Russians are doing in Crimea, or were the Ottomans in some ways directly reacting to these kind of colonial changes in Crimea when Abdülhamid decided to make an effort to get it back? And
the disagreements existed to continue after the annexation between the two countries, and there was always a very influential Crimean diaspora in Istanbul, consisting of members of the nobility and mirzas, the nobles of the area, and they had an impact over the public opinion. And another thing why the war occurred in 1787 was that the Russian demands were accepted, okay, but it was accepted under the condition that the government would continue its war preparations. And when the time is ripe, they would declare war and take back what was taken them, in an unfair way by breaching of the peace treaties. So Halil Hamid Pasha, for example, the Grand Vizier, made a great deal of preparations, and later Koca Yusuf Pasha, when he was the Grand Vizier, he stated that actually it was Halil Hamid Pasha who was executed, who actually went to this campaign with him, because he made all the preparations as much as he could, as long as the state treasury revenues and the discipline of the military allowed him. He did the preparations. However, it was again a failure, but with the French Revolution and the other developments caused by the French Revolution in Europe, Russia and Austria wanted to reach a peace agreement with the Ottoman Empire to stop any further hostilities. But that was always a hope to regain it. You might be surprised, but even in 1850, when the Crimean War started between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, there was another consultation council. And this time, Britain and France was on the side of the Ottomans, but some members of the Ottoman ulema asked the participants if we declare war, we must get Crimea back. I'm talking about 1850. And of course, Fuat Pasha, Keçecizade, Fuat Pasha, and Ali Pasha, the leading diplomats and statesmen of the period, they argued that Britain and France would never support us if we use this war rather than a war which was for self-defense. If we try to obtain new territories, they wouldn't support us. So you can see the clash between the secular bureaucracy and the religious establishment in the Ottoman Empire. Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, who about a century later wrote his history book, Tarihi Cevdet, heavily criticized the Ottoman government of the period for without firing a single shot, handing the Crimea over to the Russians, and not even issuing a counter declaration to the declaration issued by Catherine the Great. But I can say that the Ottoman statesmen of the period were rational in their decisions. They analyzed the situation and they chose ehvenisher, the lesser evil. That was also another religious explanation for the acceptance of the Russian demands, because if they declared a war at that time with Russia and Austria fighting together, with the participation of Venice and even principalities in Georgia, the Ottoman Empire would lose even more territory.
Thank you very much. George Theodosiou is next.
I believe I'd like to respond to the question as well.
Oh, okay, quickly, yes.
To Will's question, yeah. So I think for me as well, like I found this to be very interesting that in 1787, the intensity of changing the legal structures, the existing legal structures was intensified. And I believe that has to do with the war, because in the beginning in 1783, after the annexation, when the Russian authorities were trying to establish some form of government, they introduced on paper various institutions and ways of like running the newly annexed province, but they relied mainly on the nobility that exists, like the word there in Crimea, and the Crimean nobility. But in 1787, I really see a transformation, especially with regard to Sharia court records. They show how in 1783, most of the cases were adjudicated in the Islamic courts, even criminal cases, even though on paper in Russian documents shows that they established some form of criminal courts. But in reality, everything was run by Islamic judges. But in 1787, things are changing drastically. That's what I've noticed. And I think it has to do with the war as well.
Thank you. George Theodosiou?
Yes, Turkic tribes have been present on Ukrainian territory even before the Rurikids and the Kievan Rus, whether they were Ottomans or before the Ottomans. However, to me, the separation occurred when the Mongols came, and the division was between the Galician Volhynian Commonwealth and the northern migration to Vladimir and the Vladimir Suzdal, and the fact that the two entities were treated differently by the Mongols.
The whole migration.
That's where the dichotomy occurred.
That may be so, but the migration is Pogodin's thesis that when the Mongols came, the Russians left Ukraine and went to Muscovy. That's sort of, nobody takes that seriously.
Well, but half of them went to Muscovy, the other half
Apparently that's no evidence for that. But Oleksandr, you wanted to answer?
Yeah, Plokhy has a lot of evidence for it.
Yes, the fate of the people and of the dynasty, these are two different things. Of course, the dynasty died out in the territory of Ukraine, but the hard evidence about the administrative territorial division of the Mongol Empire, or in that part of the world, is there. I demonstrated the borders of Tumens, and when you mentioned Galич-Volhynia Principality, you just mentioned one part, one right bank part of Ukraine. The second, the left bank of Ukraine was at that time part of the Crimean Khanate up to the upper Don. And well, I would say it briefly, Mongols are indeed fathers of Ukrainian and Russian nations, because they really divided this territory, and territory of two Ottomans was actually absorbed by the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, whereas Muscovy developed in the territory, initially in the territory of the Ottoman, of which administrative center was in the city, town, whatever you call it, Azak. Mongol borders are still visible on the political map of Eastern Europe, and I can demonstrate it right away to you. You see, oh my, this is not. Excuse me, that was the part of different presentation. Well, that was something about. Oh yes, yes. Excuse me. For that, you see the Dniester and the Don resemble the course of the frontier, and the Dnieper divides Ukraine into two halves. And this is the only country which still preserves the trace of the former nomadic division of every state into right and left. By the way, Romania and Moldavia, which actually represent more or less the same nation, are delimited by the borders of the Ottoman, and again in the territory where Galич-Volhynia Principality emerged. You see Lithuania, and Lithuania actually came to rule over the territory of Galich-Volhynia Principality. Actually, Lithuania, just like Moscow, emerged from the territory of two Mongol Ottomans. Okay, I will cut on this because this is the evidence which is self-evident, but details are, of course.
Certainly, the Mongols, with the Mongols, the control of the steppe moved north into the forest steppe, and it was for Kiev and Rus, this was a catastrophe. One of the reasons Ukraine did not become the bad guy, the emperor, is because of the Mongols, so to say. Anyway,
but that is also the time when the church moved from Kiev to Vladimir.
That was
exactly.
Long process. Yeah. Alexander, could you turn off your PowerPoint? And next, we have two questions from the chat. The first one is from hold on, I lost. Yes, from Kirilo Perederi to Dilyara Agisheva. How come a native population of the Crimea elected different judges from what they had before in 1787? Was it a fraud similar to what we see in the so-called referendums?
I can find evidence about the elections. I think maybe it just happened informally. I'm not really sure what happened there, but there are letters referring to some kind of elections happening, and maybe it's for the purposes of making the whole transformation legitimate. So yeah, I would agree that it's something similar to what's happened
today. So next question is from Oleksandr Halenko to everyone, to the two speakers. Could you tell something about Ottomans setting up Shahbazgirai and then Bakhkirai as Crimean Khans over Bujak in the course of the 1787-1791 years? Were there any particular plans for what policies they should pursue? I guess this is to the first two speakers.
Actually, you know, the Nogais who lived in different areas in around Kuban and Bucak, they were assumed to be part of or under the sovereignty of the Crimean Khans. And even though they were appointed to that position over the Nogais, it doesn't mean that they could do much. All their success depended on a certain Ottoman victory over Russia. Only after that, the territories lost could be regained, and they could be installed on the throne. But of course, there could be some preparations for that purpose. However, the success depended on a total military victory over Russia.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? I have a few comments I'd like to make myself, if there are not. You know, I remember one of Oleksandr once pointed out in one of his publications that the sources that he read that once the Russians came into Crimea, it was for them a very foreign, ecologically, a very foreign place to them. Make my comment on that. And I have a question to you. You didn't really have time. You really didn't answer the question, what Ottoman past tempted Russia to invade Ukraine today? You could say a few words about that.
Oh, okay. Well, Russians used Ukrainian military force and the territory, which was colonized by Ukrainians, for their conquest and their policy against the Ottoman Empire. Before the time when Cossacks decided to switch from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to Muscovite state, there was no policy of the Muscovite state vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. And only after that point, the Moscow state embarked on conquest in the Black Sea area. That's very simple. Before that date, we have only one campaign, you know, very famous expedition of 1569, aimed at conquest of Astrakhan, when the Ottomans decided to dig a channel between the river Don and Volga. So this is one thing. They want to hide their dependence on Ukrainian force in the conquest of that area, and in further military advances to the Balkans and to the Caucasus area. This is that very straightforward intention. The second thing is in general, as I mentioned, Ukrainians are different from Russian due to their experience of interaction with nomads, all sorts of nomads and Turks. This is very, you know, this is a very big issue. I can only come to my point that Ukrainians learned from the Ottomans the pleasures of life, and I can show you the evidence from the late 18th century. Let me show you this picture. Unfortunately, what is difficult about Ukrainian culture is that many words, many notions. Let me look. Where is it? Where the Ottoman, the words from Turkish were translated into Ukrainian and lost any trace of their origin. But nevertheless, we have many many examples of that interconnection, even on lexical level. For example, well, I just cannot find that picture. So I'm sorry for that. But for example, in the 18th century, I just will quote from memory. Alcoholic beverages, which Ukrainians like, had Turkish names. For example, infusion of Ayvovka, which was otherwise called the vodka made out of pears from the Crimea. Another more distant term is sakizka. This is a vodka alcohol infusion of sakis, of masticha, but they use it. They use the Ottoman term, the Turkish term. I would even recall the other word, which is strictly Turkish and which denoted vodka of very bad quality, or vodka which was extremely strong, and it was called in Ukrainian chikeldycha. And no Ukrainian scholar can understand this term without tracing its etymology in Turkish. And this is çikilmak. This is knockout vodka. But interestingly enough, this term comes from Turkish, and we are now dealing with the pleasures. Alcohol is a pleasure.
Since it's Friday. I just want to say one commonplace, and that is that if it wasn't for the Ottomans and the Tatars, the Turkic steppe, there would probably be no Ukraine as we know it. What gave Ukraine after the debacle with Kievan Rus, with rebirth of the Cossack era, was the Kazakh institution, which gave Ukraine quite a bit of agency militarily. I mean, Ukraine then didn't have much of a state, had a Cossack hetman, but it really had a good army, which, by the way, I was used to lament that Ukraine doesn't have either a good state or a good army these days, but I was proven wrong as far as the second coast. Anyway, Baki, you have a question?
I do have a question, but actually, you know what? I just saw in chat somebody ask a question to Dilyara. Maybe we could give that priority, and I can wait for later.
Okay. Yes, Dilyara, from what source do you obtain the statement regarding the ulama as, quote, parasites, unquote? Also, are there any books about the change in the legal system of Crimea written in English? From Beatrice Martinez.
Yeah, I was actually going to respond to her inviting, but yes, I wrote that. I made a reference to it in my PowerPoint, so if anyone interested, I could send that references from the archives, as well as there are some academic journals from the 19th century that publish many correspondence between Russian officials, and they have a lot of those written down. In regard to the publication, I'm working on that now, so hopefully soon. Hopefully this year I'm working on my yeah, but no one has written specifically about legal reform, so this is my focus.
Yes, Baki, thank you.
Oh, my question is out of ignorance, and I worked on Osman II, as some of you would know, and I noticed the Kazakh references to the Kazakhs there. I had no idea that was the very first reference. And my question is, where does that name come from? So it's not Ukraina. It's how does that relate to Ukrainian, or how is it? Is it at all inspired by Kazakhs in Central Asia? Is there any connection etymologically? What is the and what exactly does it mean? Because it keeps coming up later in the 17th century. They come down to, they actually attack Bosphorus. They have raids during the reign of Murad IV, Kazakh ships coming down the Bosphorus, raiding little villages around the Bosphorus. It becomes a major issue, also some Black Sea, etc. So clearly they are very good fighters. So I'm sure there's a very easy explanation for this word, but I just don't know. I
I'll
would
take the
appreciate
opportunity to plug my former student Zhiyu Li's book on Kazaklik on Real. I'll send you the reference. But in general, it's an old post-Mongol institution that's had to do with people out of power trying to get back in power, and eventually became this freebooters, raiders. But the institution goes all the way. I mean, Babur was a Kazakh. He rebelled, and from India to all the post-Mongol period, the Kazakh institution was very, very important. And in the case of the Slavs, of course, it was thanks to the Crimean Tatars that the institution transformed and was taken up. But I just wanted to say one thing about the name. Well, Kazakh, Alexander meant Kazakh Taifus as sort of Kazakh people, Kazakh nation. In fact, the Ottomans did have they had another name for Ukrainians, that was Rus, and Rus Kalbi. If you this is important to say that there's a lot of misunderstanding because people do not define their terms. But in that time, there's some confusion sometimes. But in that time, there was a distinction between Rus and Moskov. And if you, for example, you can look at Invade Ukraine. I've just gone through the whole thing, the search, and except for one case, there's a very clear always distinction, and often in the same line between the Rus and the Moskov, and the Rus Kavim. And the lisan, the language, and so forth, they're very much aware of the difference. And this is, of course, the old name because this was the original Rus core region, and that name stuck. It's the same with the Italian sources, the Polish sources. So it's very important that we define our terms because you can be very, very far off. For example, the slavery issue, they're often called Rus, and probably most of them were from Rus. They're sometimes called Moskov. Sometimes there's some confusion, but in general, Ottomanists tend to say, well, these are Russians, and that's a bit of anachronistic to call them that, because most of the slave population probably was from near and very demographically active the Ukrainian lands. Anyway, maybe Oleksandr wanted to say something. That's sort of used here.
Isn't Rus a Viking term? Rus is
No,
a Viking term,
goes way
not
back,
a
of course.
Russian term.
Oh, well, originally that goes way back earlier, but eventually became the name of the Vikings, the Varangians that took on that became Slavicized.
Yes, Slavs adopted the name of Rus instead of their tribal names, whereas Scandinavians Slavicized. They switched to Slavic languages. That's very simple. And so they created the Rus nation. But by the way, Gilles Weinstein once cited very interesting definition of Muscovite prince, Rus olan Moskov begi, which means that Muscovites themselves made a certain part among Rus. So they really realized the proximity between the two and relationship between the two. But actually, Muscovites here represent a smaller entity among Rus. Okay.
Yes. Jim had a very interesting quote about that too. That I mentioned in my article about Cossacks taking slaves. But anyway, yes. Can Will Smiley?
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a follow-up question, thought about the Rus-Moscow question, because I was trying to figure this out for my own book on Ottoman slavery in the 18th century. And it does seem to me that at the beginning of the 18th century, there was a clear distinction between Rus and Moscow. And if you look at the lists of captives held in the Tersane Iamene Zindana, the banyo, the dungeon of the Ottoman shipyards, they will list some people as Rus and some as Moskov. But then as the century goes on, it gets more and more mushy. And I think by the end, eventually Rus just swallows it up. And it's almost as if the Ottomans are kind of mentally adapting to the growing power of the Russian Empire and kind of mentally taking on the idea that Russia has a legitimate claim to all these Eastern Slavic lands. So I would say the 1768 war, especially by the 87 war, Rus is everywhere. Moscow kind of dissipates. And it's almost as if you can see how the Russian Empire has just kind of co-opted that term in the Ottoman minds, to the point where in the Tersane lists, I found at least one case where the same person flips from being Moskov to Rus. as if the Ottoman scribes just don't really understand the difference anymore, which I think is fascinating. And it's just my surface level understanding trying to figure this out for my own purposes, but I think it's interesting. I think Kahraman's written about this as well, Kahraman Shakul to some extent.
Thank you. You should maybe publish those sources that you mentioned with the list. That'd be really interesting. It really was very late, yes, that the word Rus really meant Russians in general.
If I may intervene very briefly, also it was the Turkish color system was used in designating different, Russian groups along the steppe, like using the color system Ak Rus, Siyah Rus, and denoting them the system of North and South, or Rusi Hamra, the red Rus. And in Ottoman documents, as my colleague Will Smiley mentioned, it is still in some of the Ottoman documents I showed you here in this presentation. The Rus and Rusya or Rusyalı or Moscow, for example, the ambassador of Moscow, Moscow Sefiri, they are used interchangeably in Ottoman documents. And also
in 18th century.
Yes, in connection with that, the Ottomans accepted to use the official title of Catherine the Great, Tamam Rusyalar İmparatoru, which is also a reference to the different color code based system, referring to different Rus, different hordes. Maybe we can refer them as, in the case of Golden Horde or Mongol Horde, different groupings of Russia. So she was referred as Tamam Rusyalar İmparatoru. That was the official imperatoriçesi. So it was able to unify all the Rus under the banner of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, it was a word-to-word translation from Russian, Всероссийская императрица. So Ottomans simply translated this term. I don't think that they put that meaning into it.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
The only thing which is connected with that title is that it was recognized by the Ottoman state in 1747, exactly along with the abdication of any rights to Ukraine by the Ottoman state.
Yes.
Can I make it? Yeah. Sorry, I guess maybe think of something else, which is, my understanding is that 1747 convention, following up on the Belgrade Treaty, I think, where they recognized the title, the other big matter of contention they sorted out was the matter of slaves and the return of slaves. And in that same convention, the Ottomans finally worked out with the Russians a way to return captives from that war. And in doing so, there seems to be an understanding that the Russians can claim back any kind of Russian subject or Eastern Slav. So they get back Kalmyks, who are not Russian, but are Russian subjects. And they also, I think, get back a large number of Rus captives who might not be Russian subjects, but are kind of Eastern Slavs, Orthodox. And it's interesting that that goes along at the same moment with the imperial title, as if like these two things are both. I mean, Oleksandr, I think you have an article about the treaties of Belgrade and their consequences, right? This is like the way that these two things both are kind of the creeping power of the Russian Empire. And the return of slaves is kind of reinforcing Russian power symbolically over people as well. Like which slaves they get to have back is kind of expanding the empire symbolically.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I'll take this opportunity to also do some self-advertising. In the next issue of Archivum Ottomanicum, there will be a long review article of Hrushevsky's History of Ukraine Rus, the last 4 volumes that deal with the 1650s, which is the Hrushevsky volumes for Cossack Age 7 to 10 are extremely rich for Ottoman, Crimean, Moldavian history, translated very well into English. This is a review article by Caroline Finkel and myself, so be on the lookout for it. It's very informative and very apropos of the topic today. If there are no questions, I will turn over the floor to Baki.
I think there was a question in the chat. Karen had just a question.
Yes, I see. Yes. So
or
Alexander
Sasha,
mentioned
maybe.
1180. Alexander mentioned from Karen Pinty. Alexander mentioned 1187 as the earliest mention of Ukrainians in the area. So this medievalist wants to know the source and details of that info. It's the references to Ukraina as a place, I think. The
Yes.
Chronicles.
Well, somebody, Alexei Cherednichenko, shows the quotation. And in that case, that referred to the southern border of southern part of Pereyaslav Principality. Well, the south part of Kiev area.
Thank you Alexei Cherednichenko for the quote.
And I'll just read, because not everybody who will watch the recording will have access to the chat. Krilo Perederi, I might be mispronouncing this name, I'm very sorry about this. He wrote, talking about the origin of the word Cossack, from what I know is Turkic Tatar, it roughly means armed free person. So again, well, thank you everyone who joined, and thank you for the panelists. Of course, first, it is very sort of a interesting coincidence. We started talking with the annexation of Crimea, and today I think is the day when Putin officially declared that he is annexing those 4 provinces, 4 in eastern Ukraine into Russia that nobody else will ever recognize. But I don't know. The annexation of Crimea started the Eastern question in European relations, which brought down it. Actually, in a certain way, when I teach class about US in the Middle East, I tell them, you know, our invasion of Iraq, that goes back to 1774. The Eastern question, in a sense, continues in the 20th and even the 21st century. Trying to these people cannot rule themselves. We have to teach them how to rule them, and then they come and invade. So this annexation by Putin will probably start a long series of things. I also read that the United States is now building a permanent sort of connection to keep supplying Ukraine with training and arms in Germany. So we might be up for a long-term new, I don't know what to call it, it's too early to say, but we are talking about this historical moment at a very new historical moment, and both of them connect with Russian aggression. So I guess
we're living through colonial imperial war, which may end up with the empire succeeding, or it may end up with it falling apart. It's very interesting times with it.
Yeah, at this point, maybe he's overextending his chances. So maybe it will lead to a strong reaction inland, because we see the protests to the draft. Who knows? But anyway, this was a historic day, and thank you so much for the panelists for being here, sharing your expertise with us. Thank you, Victor, for sharing it again. Nihat, Dilyara, Nihat, and Sasha, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see the audience at another WhatsApp event next month. Bye.